Hey everyone, one of the cool things about Savage Worlds is that you can take different settings for the system and combine them together, reuse components in your own setting. So that's a given. But I thought today I'd just share what I did with the Fantasy Companion for my sci-fi game. Hey everyone, it's Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff. We'd love your support. Check out what I've got on Drive-Thru RPG, and you can do that through tabletoptango.com. And any support you give goes right into the channel to buy more Savage World stuff. So anyway, I wanted to talk today about what I'm doing with the Fantasy Companion as it applies to my sci-fi game that I'm running. Yeah, I took stuff from the Fantasy Companion and put it in my science fiction game. And I thank Eric for a lot of help to do that as we brainstormed and bounced ideas back and forth. So why don't I talk about that? Just not really saying this is advice on how to do it or not, but just some of the things I did, and maybe they make sense to you, and it'll give you a good idea that, yes, you can use settings, different settings and different genres for other genres, and combine and mix and match. So one of the first things I did was I allowed using the ancestries within the Fantasy Companion, and there's a lot of them, for my alien races or the races that or the ancestries that the players can be. That includes, I have cat people, I have people who are more based on dogs. We have one of the players is playing kind of a mouse folk, so a tiny little mouse folk. I have a player who's playing a bird, a race of birds. And this is all based on my original game, where the players were kind of emerging from a dark age of knowledge and rediscovering their planet had a very high technology, distant future. And a lot of the species that were on the planet at the time came from experiments, came from kind of genetic modifications. And so you had people who were based on birds, and there were lizard people, and there were canines and felines, and of course, kind of human basic folks, even though this wasn't based on Earth. So all those races and species were available for the players to take advantage of to build characters. I had in my original game had kind of mismatched one together on how I think they could be used. What would a canine folk look like, and what would be the edges, or the racial abilities, and what would be the detriments and that sort of thing. But for this game, we looked at the Fantasy Companion, and we found that there were cat-type folks, there were small creature types that could apply to the mouse folks. There were avian type creatures. So there was a lot of things that we could kind of look and say, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we'll pull that out and put that in, but we have something to start with. And so it was kind of fun to tweak from there. The second one is, obviously from settings, we can take hindrances and pull them in. Now, the players really looked at the core book for their hindrances, but there was a couple of them that they had thought about a little bit. One was jingoistic, which was a major or minor. They looked at that, maybe coming, as they explored the universe, coming from this planet of high technology that they discovered, maybe they would be looking more down on the primitives that they ran into. But in the end, didn't make sense, but it was something that they considered. And you could use it just right out of the box if it made sense for their character. And then another that they looked at was idealistic, which is a minor, and that you see things in black and white. There is no nuances and dilemmas. It's either right or wrong, and that seemed like a very interesting one for one of the players who sort of had this attitude that the science of discovery is the most important thing, and nothing else matters. And one of the players took kind of a quirk hindrance that really kind of shined in this vein of idealistic, and that single focus on how things ought to be, black and white. So definitely the hindrances are something you can take advantage of. Some of them, things where you're more susceptible to magic don't make sense. So you obviously have to check them to make sure they make sense, but pulled them in. Edges were another area, obviously, that we took advantage of. Favored terrain was one that one of the players really thought was be interesting, because favored terrain, they were thinking, the Star Wars, there's the ice planets and there's tree planets, so suddenly that would be something that would make a lot of sense to take advantage of. That's not the way this game is, so it wasn't one that really made sense. But combat, if we look at the combat edges, most of them are applicable. You can take advantage of. In the Fantasy Companion, there's some edges that enhance archery. Who's to say that just because you're in a sci-fi game, you're not going against peoples on different planets who are at that level of technology, or even as a player in a spaceship, you may not want to be using firearms. So that might be something that they'd want to take advantage of, some of those, as well as a cool one that they added, which came from, sort of started in Pathfinder, Savage Worlds Pathfinder, is the martial flexibility, which gives you the option of picking a combat edge at the beginning of a combat and taking advantage. So now you could be ultimately flexible in the edges that you have at your disposal. And one of the players thought about that. Another one, take the hit, which gives you a reroll on soak. I mean, can't go wrong with that. And that's makes sense in a fantasy game as well as a science fiction game or any other game. So you can take advantage of those sorts of things. So those are just a couple of examples, but I think the bottom line is almost all of the combat edges made sense. Almost all of the background edges made sense. The professional edges, a little less so because they had things like night, but you certainly could look at them and see if they made sense for the kind of player that you have in your game as far as the players go. Now, one of the big ones, which was Mystic Powers. That's an edge. Now, you could go, wait a second, Mystic Powers. Now, what Mystic Powers means is it's based on, in a world where magic is common, you can take this edge, and then as a fighter, in the book it says as a fighter, monk, paladin, etc., you would have access to a small pool of power points, say that fast, and that pool you could then use for self-only type commands or powers. And so, for example, for the fighter, they have to have at least a fighting of a D8 plus, take the edge, and then they get the advantage of having boost trait of fighting, shooting, strength, vigor only, protection, and smite, but all would have the personal limitation. So I thought, and Eric and I were bouncing this around, I thought, what a great way of representing kind of these super high-tech equipment the characters might be carrying, instead of using, and there's no reason you couldn't, but instead of using like arcane device rules or something like that, this Mystic Powers really played right into that flavor. Somebody could pick that as an edge, and those powers would be manifested through the fact that they had some special ancient artifact from their planet. Remember, I mentioned their planet had super technology in the past, and then went into a dark age, and then they were emerging from it. And so this technology, which feels like magic, it can boost a trait, it can boost their strength on a minute's notice or whatever, if they were playing a kind of barbarian-ish character, really kind of makes sense. They've got a device that allows them to do that. And so that's kind of cool. I thought that was a great idea. I thought to take advantage of that. Now, there's no class type ideas in my sci-fi game, so we really had to say, what's the kind of person you are? Like, if you're a scientist, what would that mean from a Mystic Powers? That might boost your trait of smarts, or it might boost a skill of science, or, something, whatever that is. But the players who took it were really more combat focused. And so obviously the fighter build, barbarian build, those kind of things made a lot of sense. And so Mystic Powers became kind of a big thing in my sci-fi game, the simple edge, the one edge out of the book. And it made a lot of sense for what we were trying to do, that super high technology manifesting as powers in the game. So that was pretty cool. I thought that was great. Setting rules, there's a couple of them they add. Usually setting rules make a lot of sense and are very tailored to the setting. But in fantasy, the fantasy companion includes Desperate Attack, which makes sense for any setting. That's where you get a better chance to hit at the expense of the amount of damage you're going to do. So Desperate Attack makes sense no matter what you're doing. And then high altitude as a new hazard. I mean, come on, we're talking a space game. Maybe not vacuum, but what happens when we have the ship that's losing oxygen and the oxygen level goes down, and so it's like they're working in a high altitude. What does that hazard then do to them? No brainer to include that one into it. There's a section on downtime, which made a lot of sense for when the players are on the space station or they're traveling between. What are they doing? And it had some rules and some things that legitimately made sense for downtime in training and getting ready and doing personal reflection and that sort of thing. Although obviously building magical devices or some of the other stuff you might be able to do while you're in downtime from a fantasy standpoint might not make sense, but that mechanic makes a ton of sense to leverage, and a lot of it was easy to use. Then, of course, the last thing is the Bestiary. I mean, come on, what a great spot to start when you're making aliens. I talked about in another video, I have no idea when it was, but about making new creatures and sort of starting with a creature and building on that creature. Fantasy Companion brings you a bestiary you can take advantage of. So does the Pathfinder, Savage Worlds Pathfinder does as well. And you can take those as kind of the baselines for alien creatures that players might run into, and then tweak them based on the environment they're coming from, or look at the new monstrous abilities that are in the Fantasy Companion, things like tentacles, and just tweak it as you want. Now, I'll also say, obviously, you can just make monsters the way you want. One of my big things is you don't have to use creation rules, just make it. But it's great to have something to base on and kind of take those stats and say, okay, this is the base. This thing can do one extra thing or two extra things. It looks a different way. Just because it has the same stats doesn't mean it looks the way. Like, for example, the characters are about to come up against what I call a orbital dragon. And this is something from the people they're going against, the antagonist of the thing. These creatures that are manipulating space-time for their own reasons, and they have these things that can go into the orbit of a planet and play with things like, they're destroying. They're destroying. Trying to think of it. They're destroying satellites, which is causing strife on the ground, which is what these guys want. And so what do these things look like? Well, I mean, come on. Let's start with a dragon. Let's add in some other things. Let's say that these things can breathe in space. Let's say these things can be non-corporeal if they have to. They can come in and come out of being. But in the end, they've got a lot of the trappings that look like a dragon. They can breathe fire. They can, slash with their tail. Why not? What the heck? I mean, and by the way, then I have a token I could drag on the board and start from, which is nice as well when you're using a VTT. So that's some of the stuff I'm using from the Fantasy Companion. I didn't say it was, nothing unique here. I mean, anybody who plays Savage Worlds probably have done something similar, but I thought I'd just share what I did. Used the ancestries, took advantage of them, some of the rules to make my fantasy or my alien races that could become part of the game. Obviously, hindrances and edges, powerful things. You can just take and use most of them as far as definitely the combat edges. Added mystic powers, but turned that into science fiction devices that are kind of unknown how they work, but they provide this kind of magical interface for the player without using the rules of arcane devices and that sort of thing. Setting rules, high altitude, no-brainer, and then always take advantage of things like Desperate Attack in any of your games, because it just is another great option for players to have. And then Bestiary, hey, come on. There's some fantasy, or those fantasy creatures are going to become my science fiction creatures on planets that players come to. And it just doesn't mean they're coming to a medieval world where there's happen to be goblins running around. The goblins could be small little creatures that look up the sky and say, the claw. You don't know. Anyway, I'm Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff, and we will catch you next time. Take it easy.